The last part is a little bit, it's with a regular paper and a paper on art. And I would want to highlight the aspect that Hannah Arendt is not only good for philosophy, political sciences, and but also for literature, for art, for performing arts, for many aspects. There are in the past conferences and expositions on Arendt, Hannah Arendt Thinking Space. There's in the end now here Joris Roelofs from Amsterdam. He is a bass clarinetist, composer and teacher at the Conservatoriju of Amsterdam, as well as a PhD candidate of the University of Amsterdam. His dissertation explores the political dimension of improvisation, drawing on the thought of Hannah Arendt to offer an alternative perspective on the practice. So this is another approach, and we are very happy that you participate in the form of thinking and a paper, presenting a paper, and presenting music today, at 7 o'clock. The other very important also participates is Mirt Komel, well known here, I think, in Slovenia, philosopher and writer, chair of the Department of Cultural Studies, teaching professor at the Faculty of Social Sciences of the University of Ljubljana, member of the editorial board of the Theory and Praxis journal, author of many articles and contributions on the work of Hannah Arendt, also co-translator of Arendt's On Violence and on Revolution. So this is your paper will be about Arendt and Athens. We start with your paper.
Thank you, everyone. Can you hear me well? Thank you. Thank you, Wolfgang. Thank you all for having me here. It's a pleasure to be in Ljubljana. It's my first time, so I'm quite excited about it. Bear with me 1 second. I just want my stopwatch. I use a stopwatch now when I do presentations, just to keep myself in check. All right. So as you can see, I changed the title slightly. And I will explain the change in the paper itself. Some of you might have the written paper. You should have a copy. It's fine if you don't. And also for your information, all the citations, all the quotes will be projected onto the screen. I'll begin today by exploring 2 letters Arendt received, both of which connect her to the idea of improvisation. The first concerns an attempt to meet J. Glenn Gray in Switzerland. He suggests to Arendt that if you don't have time for planning in advance, perhaps the best thing is for me to meet you in Basel and then we can improvise. To which Arendt responds, improvisations are always the best. Now, if I were a lazy scholar, I would use Arendt's words to support a broader point that she favored improvisation. But when Arendt says improvisations are always the best, she uses the term in a very general sense, not as artistic improvisation, improvising on stage before audiences, but in the broad sense as acting without a plan. Arendt's remark, then, cannot be interpreted as making a case for improvisation as such. Instead, it highlights how vague and slippery the term is. You can improvise anything from a salad dressing to a jazz trumpet solo to a political revolution. My second example is a letter Arendt received in 1972 from William Whitehead of Doubleday Publishers, who asked her to comment on a new publication called Ad Hocism, The Case for Improvisation. The book, authored by Nathan Silver and Charles Jenks, builds on Arendt's discussion of revolution, freedom, and the council movement, while also highlighting improvisation in everyday life and theater. Mr. Jenks, Whitehead wrote, feels that you were someone who might respond favorably to the concepts in this book. Arendt never replied. Nevertheless, Whitehead's request gives us a glimpse of how intellectuals in her lifetime connected her work with improvisation. The author of The Case for Improvisation was not alone in drawing these connections. Commentators of Arendt similarly identified commonalities between Arendt's concept of action and improvisation. Ned O'Gorman suggests that Arendtian politics is like an improvisational play with many actors that never ends. And Marieke Borren writes that as fundamentally spontaneous, action resembles improvisation. Others have drawn analogies to artistic improvisation, suggesting that improvised performance better captures Arendt's account of political action than scripted performance does. Hannah Pitkin, for example, observes that the term acting in concert may be misleading insofar as it implies a conductor, a composer, and a score. But perhaps if one thinks of a jazz concert, it will serve. Sophie Lloydelt invokes music making as a metaphor for Arendtian action, but specifies that she is thinking of jazz performances and jam sessions rather than of playing ready-made music pieces together. And David Rodowicz asserts that the formation of a polis enacts a public stage where participants feel free to create, to improvise virtuoso performances. In my first chapter, which I presented last month in Dubrovnik, I took up these scattered observations as a springboard for a more comprehensive analysis of how improvisation resembles Arendt's concept of political action. Today, I would like to first briefly explain these resemblances and then discuss how improvisation is in tension with Arendt's view of art. So let's start with these parallels between Arendt's concept of politics and improvisation. To understand how Arendtian action aligns with improvisation, a good place to start is Arendt's analogy of the performing arts and her distinction between the performing and productive arts. Arendt asserts that we often make the error of taking the word art to refer to the creative, productive arts, that is, to making. Making, however, involves the guidance of a model outside the activity itself. For example, a carpenter who makes a table has a model in mind. He sees the model first and then makes the table accordingly. Arendt considers it dangerous to conceive political action in terms of making and to regard the state or government as an artwork. Politics should rather be viewed as an open-ended performance that depends on human beings who speak and act with one another. In her essay, What is Freedom?, she points out that while the productive arts of making take place in isolation, and only their end product appears to the world, the performing arts, on the contrary, have indeed a strong affinity with politics. Performing artists, dancers, play actors, musicians, and the like need an audience to show their virtuosity, just as acting men need the presence of others before whom they can appear. Both need a publicly organized space for their work, and both depend upon others for the performance itself. As Dneva has observed, Arendt's performance model of politics, with its implication of stages and audiences, underlines that plurality is the fundamental condition of political life. Like performing artists, Arendt's political actors interact with and appear before fellow humans. The problem with Plato's model of politics as making is that it excludes plurality. It renders superfluous our political capacities, speaking, acting, and judging with one another. While making requires isolation from others, political activity depends upon others and is therefore more akin to a performance among plural actors and spectators. But Arendt's concept of action doesn't just resonate with performance, it resonates, I think, with improvisational performance. Her view of action as a play with circumstances in which something new is being established, with performers responding to unforeseeable opportunities, engaging in endless variations, makes it difficult to think of anything other than improvisation. Dneva uses the term non-sovereign performance. I think improvisation would be just fine. It would work just fine here. Before proceeding, however, it's necessary to discuss the key features of improvisational performance and how it is distinct from its scripted counterpart. So to ask kind of in an Arendtian way, perhaps, what is improvisation? As Angela Esterhammer points out, what all genres of improvisation have in common and sets them apart from scripted performance is a special relationship to temporality and the audience. Scripted performance separates the creation process, composing, playwriting, speechwriting, from the time and place of its execution, performing, play acting, or speaking. It implies that something has been written or prepared beforehand and then performed in front of an audience at a later stage, such as this paper that I'm reading to you right now. I prepared this beforehand, in contrast to the words that I just uttered right now that I'm inventing in the moment when I'm facing you. The improvisational mode does not separate creation from execution. Instead of enacting a work written by a playwright or delivering a speech by a speechwriter, improvisers create and execute their performance as they face their audience. Invention and delivery, creation and execution constitute one and the same occurrence. In improvisation, this relationship to temporality is coupled with a special relationship with the audience. The point is not only that the improviser acts in the moment, their spontaneous invention is put on public display before a live audience. Moreover, the presence of an audience has a significant impact on the production process of improvised performance. By purposefully leaving aspects of their performance unprepared, improvisers allow audience responses to co-determine how their performance will unfold. These two dimensions, inventing in the moment and audience participation, are especially evident in the originally Italian tradition of poetic improvisation, where improvisers publicly extemporized verses on themes suggested by the audience. And this is exactly what I will demonstrate tonight at 7 o'clock here during my performance. Improvisation parallels Arendt's concept of political action in many ways. Like Arendt's actor, an improvising actor in control over artistic acts, or as Vlasta mentioned earlier, a sovereign political actor or a sovereign artistic actor is a contradiction in terms. Since improvisers view the inherent unpredictability of plurality, the reactions of fellow performance and audience responses not as an impediment but as a precondition for free performance, improvisation can be said to put Arendt's theory of non-sovereign freedom into practice. Yet the fact that improvisation as a metaphor aptly captures Arendt's performative model of politics does not mean that improvisation aligns with her conception of the performing arts. Hannah Pitkin is right that the term concert is misleading as a metaphor for Arendtian political activity if we read concert to mean scripted and conducted performances. And Sophie Lloydelt rightly invokes the metaphor of improvisational jazz rather than ready-made pieces. But ready-made pieces are exactly what Arendt has in mind when she uses the term performing arts. The concerts and theater plays Arendt is known to have attended, from Brecht to Camus and from Mozart to Karl Orff, involved scripted performances. In her written work, she equally takes for granted a scripted mode, On the rare occasions when she discusses music, she uses terms such as music piece, writing something down, or composing a melody. She sometimes conflates musician with composer. For example, when she maintains that the artist, whether painter or sculptor or poet or musician, produces worldly objects. Regarding theater, which she considers the political art par excellence, it is equally clear that she has scripted plays in mind. She even describes theater plays as works of art. There is an irony here. While Arendt complains that we often make the error of taking the word art to refer to the creative, productive arts, she herself does precisely that. Finally, Arendt is completely silent on a highly improvisational art form, jazz. Arendt lived in New York City as early as 1941. Her first apartment on Morningside Drive was only a 12-minute walk from Minton's Playhouse, where the bebop jazz revolution was taking place, led by young black musicians. And yet the term jazz is absent from her published work, her correspondence, and from the brand new volume Hannah-Arendt und die Weltlichkeit der Künste. So, when Arendt writes about the performing arts and its strong affinity with politics, she has scripted performance in mind. Yet the image of actors of executing pre-written scores and scripts fits uneasily with the spontaneity Arendt ascribes to her political actors. Arendt's performing arts metaphor, if it is to capture her conception of politics, must be expanded to include improvisational performance, even if she herself never considered improvisation. This is what I argued in the first chapter. But instead of further identifying parallels between Arendt's concept of action and improvisation, I now want to highlight the divergences between improvisation and her view of art. Those who want to make a case for improvisation might be tempted to invoke Arendt's theory of freedom and new beginnings to valorize improvisation and to position Arendt as their ally. And I, too, succumbed to that lure in the early stages of my research. My dissertation proposal basically reads as an Arendtian manifesto for improvisation. Isn't improvisational performance the activity of natality par excellence, we are tempted to say, given that freedom and spontaneity are its prime features? Isn't a bebop jazz performance or improvisational theater the very embodiment of performing miracles and interrupting automatic processes? Had Arendt taken that 12-minute walk to Minton's Playhouse, would she not have embraced jazz improvisation as an art form she unknowingly supported but had never experienced? I don't think so. Not only is artistic improvisation outside her experience, it's also in tension with what she considers to be the political function of art. In what follows, I want to address at least two such tensions. First, Arendt's ambivalence toward the inherent unpredictability of political action and its performance character, and two, her understanding of the productive arts as a remedy for the fleetingness of political action. Improvisation discourses that look to Arendt for guidance typically highlight her celebratory account of unpredictable action and of natality as making new beginnings. But a closer look at Arendt's thought reveals her ambivalence towards both. As Jacques Tamigneau has shown, she is ambivalent about the performance character of action. Arendt's emphasis on performance, he thinks, does not amount to an unambiguous celebration, but is at once its blessing and its curse, a curse which necessitates a redemption. While Arendt, when describing production, uses positive words such as durability, objectivity, tangibility, she uses negative words such as boundlessness and unpredictability when she describes action. Similarly, Margaret Canavan takes Arendt's writings to carry warnings against the haphazardness of political action, not just the opportunities, but also the dangers they offer. Arendt's warnings of action's inherent unpredictability are even more apparent in the German version of the human condition, the Vita Activa. Here, unpredictability is translated with two words, Unvorhersehbarkeit and Unabsehbarkeit, both of which translate to unforeseeability. Arendt uses these German words and the term unforeseeability, which aligns with the Latin roots of improvisation, improvisus, mostly pejoratively, negatively. I'll give you a few examples. She talks about a cure for unforeseeability, the burden of unforeseeability, and a future whose unforeseeability threatens one. Improvisation theorists have also drawn on Arendt's concept of natality, the capacity to make a new beginning. Davide Sparti, for example, connects natality to experimental jazz, the power to begin, and accomplishing the entirely unexpected. But just as with unpredictability, Arendt does not wholeheartedly celebrate the capacity for new beginnings, but shows an ambivalent stance toward it. Take her remarks in On Revolution. It is in the very nature of a beginning to carry with itself a measure of complete arbitrariness. The beginning has, as it were, nothing whatsoever to hold on to. And in the Vita Activa, again, Arendt talks about a tremendous and tremendously dangerous capacity as that of freedom and beginning. For Arendt, then, our capacity for unpredictable action and the freedom for spontaneous new beginnings is Janus-faced, referring to the Roman god Janus, often depicted with a double-faced head. Action is at once the highest and greatest possibility of humankind and the most dangerous of all human abilities and capabilities. Through action, human beings have the capacity to at once perform miracles and bring about disasters. Action is a virtue and a vice. Far from unambiguously applauding the unpredictability of free action, Arendt goes to great lengths to offer remedies to the disabilities of non-sovereignty. Remedy is a central concept for Arendt, and the German version expands it into two terms, the German version of the human condition, Abhilfe, remedy, and the even stronger word Heilmittel, which means cure or medicine. While the remedies of promising and forgiving have been much discussed in the literature, I would like to here focus on the remedy of the productive arts. Arendt sees the arts as having a complementary function in relation to politics. Art can offer stabilization and durability to the fleetingness that pervades human actions and words. She puts it poetically in Culture and Politics. Events, deeds, words, and eventually the stories to be derived from them are themselves so fleeting that they would barely survive the hour or the day of their emergence if memory and the productive capacities of people did not come to their aid. Or even more dramatically in Vita Activa. For however eloquent in words and vigorous in deeds someone may be, neither words nor deeds leave behind any trace in the world. Nothing bears witness to them once the brief moment has passed, during which they swept through the world like a breeze or a wind or a storm, shaking the hearts of human beings. Throughout her writings, Arendt stresses this frailty of human deeds and words, and again, in Vita Activa, frailty is split into Zerbrechlichkeit, frailty, and Brüchigkeit, brittleness. The haphazard and contingent realm of deeds and words is doomed to oblivion and depends for its very survival on the salvation, Rettung, offered by poets and writers. They, after all, have the capacity to transform words and deeds into memorable, repeatable, and eventually written stories. Arendt is fascinated by this transformation from fleeting words to remembrance and from stories to written, tangible things. In Natur und Geschichte, she writes, "The task of the poet and historian is to handle remembrance in such a way that something durable, a lasting thing emerges from it. This can only be done through production, through poesis. But this poetic producing is directly inspired by remembrance, because only in memory do the livelily spoken word and the livelily done deed obtain enough durability to become thing-like, from the memorable and hence ever-repeatable poem to eventually the written word and book." In light of Arendt's concern with art as preservation, as transforming words and deeds into permanent things, her seeming preference for the performing arts and for the productive arts in What is Freedom appears more complex. Arendt's descriptions of performance as leaving no end product behind also carry an undertone of tragicness. Take, for example, her remarks at the American Society for Christian Ethics. First, she invokes Aristotle's example of flute playing. In the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle talks about flute playing. Flute playing is an activity that has its end only in itself. It does not leave any end product outside the activity. Next, she draws a sharp distinction between the productive and the performing arts. The productive arts become part and parcel of our habitat, of our world, We can still go to theater plays and see them. The stability, the imperishability of these works of art is enormous. But over against this stands the instability of the performing arts. At the moment the concert is over, the thing itself has already disappeared. Now, if we look at political activity, it has more to do with performing arts than with the productive arts. Like in What is Freedom, Arendt invokes the performing productive arts binary to illustrate that we should interpret political action as performance rather than production. But she also departs from What is Freedom, and that she explicitly ties the performing arts to the instability of politics. Political activity for Arendt has more to do with fleeting activities that leave no end products behind, such as flute playing, than with things and artworks that are marked by imperishability, such as theater plays. So, her view of the performing arts, like her view of political action, is Janus-faced. It pivots depending on whether she wants to highlight action's contingency as a promise or as its predicament, as virtue or vice, ability or disability. While the performing arts metaphor serves to underline Arendt's concern for free, contingent action in conditions of plurality, it simultaneously highlights that political activity is in desperate need of being rescued by the realm of things and artworks. So, what does all this mean for improvisation? To what extent can we connect Arendt to jazz concerts, jam sessions, and improvisational theater plays, as several commentators have done? I've tried to show that while improvisation serves as an apt metaphor for Arendt's concept of political action, it clashes with her view of the arts. If the task Arendt contributes to art is to save the fleeting nature of political action by offering its durability and permanence, then improvisation is not up to that task. Durability and permanence are not to be found in the unstable performance mode that is improvisation, but in the stable arts of production. Not in fleeting jam sessions or free improvisations, but in ready-made plots, poems, and compositions that can always be repeated. The point of improvisation is to produce a performance that can never be repeated. The fact that improvisation leaves nothing durable behind is something improvisers themselves have been well aware of. Arendt's concern with fleetingness versus durability finds a striking parallel in the poetic improviser Janina Milli, who lamented the fleeting nature of her song, its insubstantiality compared to a model of poetic resilience and durability often identified with Dante. This prompts further questions. How can Arendt's reflections on art and politics shed critical light on improvisation studies? And conversely, how can an account of improvisation fill a gap in Arendt's view of the arts? I have some thoughts on this, and perhaps you do too, but I suggest saving that for the discussion. In closing, let me briefly highlight one sense in which Arendt's writings can be used as guidance for improvisation studies. Political readings of improvisation often discuss improvisational performance as a positive model for political action. They celebrate improvisation as good for music, good for people, good for the world. These utopian or optimistic accounts would do well to take to heart not just Arendt's celebrations, but her reservations for unpredictable action and spontaneous new beginnings. A more honest assessment of improvisation would acknowledge its Janus-faced nature. Martin Luther King Jr. famously improvised the I Have a Dream portion of his speech in 1963, but improvisation might be just the right tool for anti-democrats. Take Donald Trump, who positions himself as a staunch defender of improvisation, both in the broad sense of the word, a general disregard for official policy and preparation, and in the narrow sense as improvising his speeches. I don't mind making this speech without a teleprompter, Trump said at his recent address for the UN. That way you speak more from the heart. It seems that I just debunked my own project, which was initially supposed to bring Arendt and improvisation together. Instead, I've only driven them further apart by identifying the various ways in which Arendt's theory of art is incompatible with improvisation. However, we can only speculate how Arendt might have reacted to the experience of improvised performance. Had she taken that 12-minute walk to Minton's Playhouse or discussed improvisation with John Cage at the 8th Street Club, what would her opinion on improvisational performance have been? I think she would have agreed that improvised performance captures the haphazardness inherent in a plurality of agents, but I also think she would have added that it's precisely the improvisational nature of action that desperately needs remedies and cures. Improvisations are always the best, she wrote to Gray. Had she known that all her private letters would be exposed to the bright light of the public, that an army of improvisation scholars are eager to turn her into their ally, and that an authoritarian charlatan in the White House is only too happy to put improvisation on a pedestal, she surely would have reflected on her statement and modified it into something like, improvisations are not always the best. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joris. I think this the thesis goes together with what Vlasta presented here, and your thesis of debunking your own project is very challenging. So now we hear Mirt.
Thank you. First, an apology that I don't have paper renderings. The reason being that, on the one hand, I thought I have plenty of time to prepare one, since I wrote it already in deep July this summer. But on the second hand, this semester caught me off guard, and I was making the last touches this morning, and still it isn't finished. There is one quote I need to check and two problematic passages, but hopefully you will not notice them, because you will not have the paper in front of you. The other is not an apology, an acknowledgement that this paper is basically a continuation of a paper I delivered in Dubrovnik a few years ago during the discussions we had with Vlasta and Wolfgang and Christina and the group that were participating at the Arendt conference at that time, where I rendered a paper on Arendt and Thukydides on war. And this was the result of the talks we had afterwards, after the paper. On a more general level, the result of a reading group we had during the pandemic online with Vlast and then another in Gorast, another group where we read The Life of the Mind, and we also tentatively translated portions of it, and I hope that in the near future the Slovenian translations could be published. Now, as far as Arendt and the Greeks are concerned, probably don't need to remind you that her recurrent return to the Greek authors, philosophers and poets alike is marked, of course, by a very modern concern, a concern for politics in the 20th century. And that my most general take on this is that we also need to return not only to Arendt, but to Arendt's return to the Greeks. We need a return of this return in order to tackle and to face the harsh political reality we are dealing with nowadays. On a level of idea, I want to connect two texts, two books. One is, of course, The Human Condition, and the other is The Life of the Mind. Still sticking to these general remarks, I think it's noteworthy that she first researched the active part of the human condition from a philosophical perspective in order to show how politics were slowly instrumentalized by being incorporated into the artistic milieu of the Homo faber, where they were in turn reduced to the Machiavellistic means to an end logic until the eventual victory of the animal laborans. This in the Vita Activa, while in the Life of the Mind, later on, at the end of her life, she decided to turn her attention to the contemplative life of the mind in order to extrapolate political thinking from this, as discerned from certain aspects of thinking, willing, and especially, of course, the missing chapter on judging. Now, if I still stick to a general level of remarks, if I generalize this characteristic of the two works, I would say that in the first instance, she tried to access the active aspects of the human condition, man's capacity for political praxis, artistic creation, poiesis, and working labor or ponos. From a very specific, I would say, philosophical perspective, namely by interpreting these three activities as philosophical concepts. While in the second, she tried to grasp the, let's say, passive, contemplative life of the mind from the active political side of things, by rereading the history of philosophy as a kind of political activity, and that would be the content of the Life of the Mind, of course. It seems to me that this double encounter between the two, philosophy and politics, or if you prefer the more mundane wording between theory and practice, is not only the kernel of her political thought and the reason why her way of thinking is still so intriguing for us, but also the reason why the Greeks were so intriguing for Arendt. If there is a world where this complex relationship between thinking and action coincides, then it can be found precisely in the world of the Greeks, where, however, Arendt introduces a very peculiar and very distinctively Roman distinction between vita contemplativa and vita activa. Now, I will focus on this aspect first before proceeding to the main part. I find it very peculiar that Arendt never wrote a book on politics. Her own opus speaks of nothing else but politics, but no book of politics per se. However, thanks to the gods, Aristotle did instead. It is to Aristotle's politics and its initial definition of the polis as a community, having in view the common good, that Arendt turns if she wants to show us, for instance, the connection between the Greek polis and the Roman Respublica, for the definition of which she in turn turns to Cicero's De Republica as definition of the Respublica as public thing. Namely, both being spheres of freedom that elevate human life from everyday futility to immortal divinity. I quote from the Vita Activa, For the polis was for the Greeks, as the res publica was for the Romans. So the analogy between the two very different kinds of states. First of all, their guarantee against the futility of individual life, the space protected against this futility and reserved for the relative permanence, if not immortality, of mortals. End of quote. However, from Socrates' death and Plato's dismissal of politics in favor of another kind of immortality, the almost exclusive access to the eternal realm of the ideas, and especially since the rise of Christianity, this Platonism for the masses, as Nietzsche puts it, a certain reversal takes place where the public vita activa becomes subsumed to the private vita contemplativa. Another quote from the same book by Arendt, the fall of the Roman Empire plainly demonstrated that no work of mortal hands can be immortal, and it was accompanied by the rise of the Christian gospel of an everlasting individual life to its position as the exclusive religion of Western mankind. And I would add, and both of them, even more than philosophy, succeeded, to continue the quote, so well in making the vita activa and the bios politikos the handmaidens of contemplation, that not even the rise of the secular in the modern age and the concomitant reversal of the traditional hierarchy between action and contemplation suffice to save from oblivion the striving for immortality which originally had been the spring and center of the vita activa. End of quote. Now, I'm sure you know the rest of the story, the modern history of the revolutions that for a brief moment revitalized the public sphere with a worldwide call for action and their eventual capitulation in front of the nation-state and its capitalistic apparatus. And that is why I want to make a step back and examine this very fundamental distinction that shapes the whole book dedicated to and entitled Vita Activa. As far as the conceptual distinction between vita activa and vita contemplativa go, it is noteworthy that Aristotle introduces this distinction not in his politics, but rather in his ethics. But this distinction is, of course, part of a larger tripartite distinction that Aristotle makes. To quote Aristotle, for there are, we may say, three prominent types of life. That just mentioned, that is life devoted to pleasure, the political, and thirdly, the contemplative life. Despite the initial critique of Plato and the assertion that the purpose of Aristotle's book on ethics is not contemplation but action, not knowing what good is but rather practicing virtue, at the very end he still deems the contemplative way of life the best one, or at least the one that can best provide happiness or eudaimonia. Nevertheless, it is from this Aristotle's distinction that Arendt actually commences the human condition, later on focusing only on the fate of bios politikos by contrasting it to the bios theoretikos, almost immediately translated into their Latin equivalent of vita activa and vita contemplativa, leaving the bios hedonikos aside. And this is one of the things I would like to pursue in a future paper under the title of Arendt and Cigarettes. I think that's the bios hedonikos that Arendt herself pursued smoking, as we discovered yesterday. And I checked if it's true, and actually it's Samantha Hill's new biography on Hannah Arendt. She states inside that Arendt preferred smoking Lucky Strike, Common, and Chesterfield. But after her first heart stroke, she switched in dialogue with her physician. She switched to Cools. These are mint cigarettes. It's a very bizarre biographical fact that I would like to pursue on one occasion or other. Anyhow, Arendt's take on Aristotle is the following. I'm quoting again Vita Activa. Aristotle distinguished three ways of life, three bioi, which men might choose in freedom, that is, in full independence of the necessities of life and the relationships they originated. This prerequisite of freedom ruled out all ways of life chiefly devoted to keeping oneself alive. Not only labor, which was the way of life of the slave, who was coerced by the necessity to stay alive and by the rule of his master, but also the working life of the free craftsman and the acquisitive life of the merchant. In short, it excluded everybody who, involuntarily or voluntarily for his whole life or temporarily, had lost the free disposition of his movements and activities. There are a few things to note in this context and a few questions that I would like to raise. Now, first, the general change of wordings from Greek to Latin is telling, especially due to the fact that for Arendt, as we have just seen, the most relevant criterion for this tripartite distinction is freedom. Freedom, which is a concept that is rarely used by Aristotle himself, at least in his Ethic, thus pointing us into the direction of her interpretation of the Roman political experience, or the Roman experience of res publica. Now, the following questions, I think, arise. Does Hannah Arendt interpret the Greeks in Roman terms, despite stating the obvious, namely that the Roman tradition is derived from the Greek, although as a certain kind of break in the tradition? Second, by contrasting vita activa and vita contemplativa in their pre-Christian Latin versions and their contemporary English, German, and other translations, she actually establishes a continuity not only between the Roman and Christian world, but also between both and our modern predicament, while keeping the Greeks somehow out of the story as some kind of political island or utopia from which she can then draw the original meaning of politics, a peculiar term that, as Arendt herself points out many times, is somehow lost in translation, since there are no Latin equivalent for politics, but what the Romans labeled as civis, civitas, etc. And the third question, where did the bios hedonikos disappear in her argument? Now, the above quoted passage continues in a very curious way. Arendt follows up on the same thought: the three ways of life have in common that they were concerned with the beautiful, that is, with things neither necessary nor merely useful. The life of enjoying bodily pleasures, in which the beautiful, as it is given, is consumed. The life devoted to the matters of the polis, in which excellence produces beautiful deeds. And the life of the philosopher devoted to the inquiry into and contemplation of things eternal, whose everlasting beauty can neither be brought about through the producing interference of man, nor can it be changed through his consumption of them. End of quote. Now, why did I say that is a very curious passage? Because the question of beauty leads Arendt directly in the relationship with Greek poetry and Greek art in general, and especially with Aristotle's Poetics, where poetry and history go hand in hand, because they, to put it bluntly, because I don't have time to go into Aristotle's argument, they immortalize political action. And in this context, it is in such contexts that Arendt usually quotes Pericles, who in his funerary speech, as written and imagined by Thucydid, said that the polis of Athens can provide its citizens with a durable public space so that no poetry and no history is even necessary for the preservation of their political actions, which are, in a certain Aristotelian sense from the Ethics, even more durable than scientific discoveries. Moreover, the curiosity of these passages lies in the fact that the whole passage quoted above strikingly resembles not Aristotle's argument from the Ethics, but rather Plato's argument in the Symposium, where the gradual development of love, beautiful bodies, beautiful deeds, beautiful thoughts, and elevation to the very idea of beauty, and even more, Plato's dealing with beauty here in the Symposium and in other dialogues as well, including the famous critique of poetry from his Politeia. All of this functioned as the basis, all of this Plato's treatise on beauty functioned as a basis for what became known as aesthetics, a term, as we all probably know, coined first by Baumgarten in 1745 as episteme aestheticae, or the science of what it sensed and imagined. And then later on he developed this idea into his own aesthetica. To quote from Baumgarten, aesthetics, the theory of the liberal arts, the logic of the lower capacities of cognition, the art of thinking beautifully, the art of the analogon rationis, is the science of sensible cognition. Now, Baumgarten's concept of aesthetic was taken on most eminently by Hegel, who in his lectures of aesthetics defined them as philosophy of beauty, the development of the idea of beauty as the concept of beauty and its realization in the sphere of concrete artworks of architecture, sculpture, painting, music, and of course poetry. Now, despite the fact that Hegel posed nothing less than community as an essential moment in the development of the idea of beauty, which is, I think it's an eminently Arendtian move from Hegel's part, and at least a move that would fit perfectly Arendt's interpretation of art. It was, as we again all know, it was Kant that caught her attention. Kant, in his critique of judgment, who was taken as a model for the faculty of judgment, was taken as a model for political thinking on various occasions, including the missing chapter of her last book of The Life of the Mind, which was supplemented by some excerpts from her lectures on Kant's political philosophy, which we have now also in Slovenian translation. Now, okay, this on the one side, I beg you keep in mind on the one hand, and now for my final part, moving from the human condition to the life of the mind. Now, the human condition ends with a quote, a striking sentence that is ascribed to Cato by Cicero in the Res Publica, and which in the English translation is rendered as this: never is he more active than when he does nothing, never is he less alone than when he is by himself. A quote that illustrates a point that seemingly goes in completely different direction from what the whole book was about. Namely that if no other test, quoting Arendt again, if no other test but sheer activity were to be applied to the various activities within the vita activa, it might well be that thinking as such would surpass them all. Thinking as the most active form of activity. That should be one of the results of the book on vita activa that we should extrapolate. However, I said seemingly because the point is clausal to the political precondition of thinking that she mentions just before the quote above, which of course cannot be upheld without political action. Again, to quote the very last pages of the book, thought finally, which we, following the pre-modern as well as the modern tradition, omitted from our reconsideration of the vita activa, is still possible, and no doubt actual, wherever men live under the conditions of political freedom. Unfortunately, and contrary to what is currently assumed about the proverbial ivory tower independence of thinkers, no other human capacity is so vulnerable, and it is in fact far easier to act under conditions of tyranny than it is to think. Very striking quote as an ending of such a book. I will not go into this discussion of political action as precondition of thinking. I will go now straight to the question of thinking as it is developed in the life of the mind. As Arendt herself states in the very beginning of the book, she decided to explore the activity of thinking precisely by starting with the same quote that ended the discussion on the human condition, with the intention of elucidating the experience of thinking through another tripartite distinction: thinking, willing, and judging. Together, and this quote from Cicero attributed to Cato, now in this book comes together with another quote, this time from Plato's Statesman. Every one of us is like a man who sees things in a dream and thinks that he knows them perfectly and then wakes up to find he knows nothing. This was, let's say, the philosophical impulse, while she also says that the immediate impulse for this whole endeavor came from attending the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem, where she witnessed the banality of evil as thoughtlessness, or the inability to think. And the third reason she mentions is a little bit more complex, but can be broken down to the following parts. Namely, that the factual experience, the experience of totalitarian thoughtlessness, goes counter to the wisdom of ages, especially the philosopher's understanding of what is thinking. And this is even more clearly stated at the end of the first part of the book, where she says that she had clearly joined the ranks of those who for some time now have been attempting to dismantle metaphysics and philosophy with all its categories, as we know them from their beginning in Greece until today. So she admits that she joined the rank with other philosophers and thinkers who in the 20th century, of course, went counter the, let's say, mainstream philosophy, or philosophy understood as mere metaphysics. Or to put it bluntly, in Arendt's case, Arendt tries to save and redefine thinking from two extremes, one being thoughtlessness as the absence of thinking, and the other being philosophy, synonymous with metaphysics, as some kind of excess of thinking. Thus joining at the very end Heidegger, whom she quotes at the beginning of the first part dedicated to thinking. The famous quote by Heidegger that Arendt uses is the following: "Thinking does not bring knowledge as do sciences. Thinking does not produce usable practical wisdom. Thinking does not solve the riddles of the universe. Thinking does not endow us with the power to act." Now, in this sense, one could indeed read The Life of the Mind as a continuation of Heidegger's project, but if the latter practiced, let's say, negative deconstruction of metaphysics and ontology, like most philosophers did in the 20th century in their, let's say, critical stance toward metaphysics, then Arendt critically took her stance in order to give a more, let's say, positive appropriation of the philosophical tradition down to the Greeks by trying to show, as I mentioned earlier, the political inside thinking. Thus, one could agree with Tamino, an author who, in his article on Arendt, Disciple de Heidegger, made the following remark regarding the comparison between the two authors in relation to the Greeks. In both cases, Arendt and Heidegger, the relation to the Greeks plays a very important role. In both cases, what is at stake is to question conceptual schemes that become passe-partout. In both, finally, this questioning aims at bringing back these conceptual schemes to the forgotten phenomenal basis which at the origin founded them, and in contrast, it is much more the extra-philosophical testimony of the experience of action, and particularly Homer, and of the experience of political activity, for example, Thucydides, that helped Arendt and allowed her to rejoin the phenomenal basis of vita activa. No archaism here, this basis would not be exactly that if they were not susceptible of an actual retake, and so on. Now, as Tamino puts it, the difference between Arendt and Heidegger would be that the accent on thinking is switched. While Heidegger used thinking in order to distinguish thinking from philosophy and to distantiate himself from the whole philosophical tradition, Arendt insisted on rediscovering the political inside thinking, at least in this book, as discernible from the above-mentioned definition of thinking as pure activity, which stands in sharp contrast to Heidegger's definition of pure thinking as something that does not bring knowledge or usable practical wisdom, neither solves the riddles of the universe, nor endow us with the power to act. I would like to argue that thinking is the very power of action, and I would like to do so by referring to what Arendt has to say about Homer, and this will be my last take on the problem. Swift as a thought is a metaphor that Homer uses in his Iliad to describe Iris, the personal messenger of Zeus, when she is sent from Mount Olympus to convey this or that decision of the father of the gods to the mortals in the earthly realm below. Discussing metaphors, this bridge between the seen and the unseen, Arendt says that it was Homer who discovered this original poetical tool. And quite a bold statement. Homer invented the metaphor, the peculiarity of which stands in strike contrast. So the peculiarity of Homer's own usage of the metaphor stands in strike contrast to the reversible, almost mathematical definition that Aristotle gives in his Rhetorics. One can define what cannot be, Aristotle's take in his definition of the metaphor in his Rhetorics is basically that it's an enigma that needs to be deciphered, and you can easily switch between the two sides that you use, what you use as metaphor and what is omissed, and that you can reverse both and producing another kind of enigma by using the same elements, so to speak, twice. For Arendt, the specificity of Homer's usage of metaphor is the following. One can define what cannot be seen through what is seen, but significantly, the reverse will not work, Arendt says. One can compare the tearing onslaught of fear and grief on the hearts of men to the combined onslaught of winds from several directions on the waters of the sea. But the reverse would indeed not work. If one would want to describe the stormy waters of the sea with the metaphors of fear and grief, it would simply not work. And one cannot marvel enough at her pointing out to this very peculiar logic of the Homeric metaphor, namely that it makes the invisible visible. That's its function. This in turn presupposes a middle ground where the invisible of the soul and the visible world can meet. To quote again from The Life of the Mind, behind the opposition of world and soul, there must be a unity that makes the correspondence possible, an unknown law, to quote Goethe, equally present in the world of the senses and the realm of the soul, and this is precisely the hidden unity that becomes the topic of philosophers, the koinos logos of Heraclitus, the hen kai pan of Parmenides. End of quote. Philosophy, she concludes before proceeding in her discussion of the link between language and thinking, another massive topic that I cannot possibly go into now. She says that philosophy did go to Homer's school in order to emulate his example on a different level. And one's tendency to agree, the quote continues, is considerably strengthened by the two earliest, most famous, influential of all taught parables, Parmenides' voyage to the gates of day and night and Plato's cave parable. This suggests at least how right Heidegger was when he called poetry and thinking close neighbors. And one could deduce from this that not only are thinking and poetry close neighbors, but that action and thinking actually live under the same roof. For it is this hidden unity between the senses and the soul that allows the specific way in which I think Arendt thinks thinking as action. In short, despite her dismissal of this unity as a metaphysical fallacy, as she says, that can be enacted only through metaphors, it is precisely this unity, the age-old Parmenidean tu garauto noen estinte kai enai, this identification of thinking and being, that functions as a precondition for identifying the elusive moment of action in the milieu of thinking itself. However, this unity, at least after the break in tradition, cannot be grasped as directly as it was graspable for the Greeks. That is, as a simple abstract unity of being and thinking, but rather should be grasped through the impossibility of their unity, an impossibility that is nevertheless a relational unity. And the name of this impossibility is politics. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mirt. There are several overlapping topics now over the days, and whoever wants to start is free to bring more aspects in or refer to what was discussed in today and yesterday. So there.
A rather simplistic question to the first speaker. What has happened during the last decades that it's possible that people like Trump, so the improvisers like Trump, are able to hold positions which are of major importance in the world, or the other way around? Is it possible that it's been always like that? Just the information about individuals were not so very much accessible and available as they are now, so that people who were holding those important positions maybe were always similar to those improvisers of today.
I'm so sorry. The beginning of the second part of your question, I didn't hear what you were saying. I'm sorry. Would you mind repeating it?
Yeah, it was like a cynical remark. Is it possible that it's always been like that, so that improvisers like Trump were holding or trying to hold those important positions, just that we did not really know how they are? Because the information on individuals in the past were not so readily available on basically anybody as they are today. So today we can learn anything practically about Trump, but like about Roosevelt, probably people did not have any possibility to learn about him. But I think this was not the best case. Maybe maybe some other world president would be a better example to compare.
Should I answer now? Yes. Thank you. Yes. Let me see. So you were asking how is it possible that improvisers such as Trump become president? And then the second part was about has it not always been the case that improvisers did hold these positions, but it's just because now today we know more about whether or not they are improvisers and the social media. Okay. So as to the first part of your question, I don't know. I don't know how it is possible that improvisers I guess this reveals the ambivalence of the very word improvisation and improviser that I've been trying to point out today too. Trump as an improviser is kind of someone who plays with that rhetoric of improvisation as well, in the sense that he improvises and by improvising both his speeches and by bragging about that he doesn't prepare for meetings, he is kind of demonstrating a certain sense of sincerity or independence, that the idea that he is not, that there's no spin doctors behind him or something like that. I think that's how he uses it. Perhaps there is a certain, from an audience perspective, so political audience perspective, perhaps there is, but I think there has always been a certain need for their leaders, their political, for politicians to be improvisers, in the sense that the audiences want their politicians to be able to be in the moment and to be for real and to be sincere and authentic and those kind of things. I think Trump is kind of very slyly takes advantage of that kind of that more general need or audience expectation. I think in that sense that might be one of the reasons. You mentioned Roosevelt in the second part of your question. There's a few articles on Roosevelt being a great improviser. But then they are talking about the way that he dealt with unexpected circumstances, or how he pulled off the the New Deal era and how he handled that. So I hope that answers your question. I don't think it does really, but I think some of these things for like expectation of improvisation, I think that goes way back, that audience expectation. So in that sense, I think we shouldn't be too surprised that someone like Trump is in office now. Thanks.
Yes.
Thank you, and thank you very much for your talks. I mean, it's always in this conference that things things start to come together at the end somehow, and they link to each other, and which I really like. And I have a comment on Mirt's paper, and I could not support you more than I would like to in your attempt to show actually that a thinking is active life. So, and also that what you said actually to the certain extent, and you have also shown very well that thinking is conditioned by politics to the large extent, by the existence of politics in the Arendtian sense, I would say, not politics understood as domination and repression, etc., etc. So and this is actually what was my remark when I was discussing with Wolfgang yesterday. However, do you really say that thinking is action, or do you say that thinking is active life? Because I think there is a difference here. I do think, I mean, and it happens much too often, and this really causes misunderstandings in the interpretation of Arendt's concepts, because especially because of the title, the German title of the human condition, which is vita activa, and it's actually not what Arendt does. She does not show us vita activa. She does show us the conditions, the human condition actually, to the certain extent that enables us to be active, I would say, in terms of, I would say, being in the world, but not being in the world in the sense, I would say, of when thinking way of the being in a word. So I think that this equation of politics with action in Arendt's work is wrong, because in Arendt, action is not politics. So action can be dangerous. Action can be acting into nature. Action can be also action in terms of scientific production, experimentalism, etc., etc. So, and this is actually what Joris tackled to the large extent, and why improvisation can be very dangerous. So, and I liked your question, by the way, very much. So I would say that we should differentiate between active life, whereby thinking is a part of the acting life, definitely, and action as a concept within the life, the human condition, which tries to explain one part, and I mean differentiation actually between the labor, work, and action, etc. So and this occurs very often, and then I think we fall actually back to the traditional distinction between theory and practice, which Arendt tries to overcome, because we always ask ourselves, where is this link between theory and practice? How do we jump from one to another? Do we have to reverse it? And she speaks in Vita, in the human condition, actually, about these philosophical reversals which always occur, and especially with the 11th thesis in Marx then. So yeah, this is my observation to your paper.
No, I cannot but agree, and thank you for the precisations. But I would say that, at least in the life of the mind, she does, reproduce the age-old distinction between theory and praxis, with a very peculiar example, where she compares the position of the philosopher as someone who goes, let me put it bluntly, out of society in order to think the eternal ideas, etc. So as an individual that detaches himself or herself from society in order to think, where the contemplation of the ideas is compared by Arendt herself with the philosopher's position is compared to the position of spectator. So the experience, she says that the experience that the philosophers did in their, let's say, real life was the experience of spectators that look upon actions, be it real actions in terms of wars or artistic actions as reproduced in the form of theater or the such. So let's say the passive, non-active side of things that puts the philosophers in the position of a spectator, the ideal spectator of history. I think she quotes Kant and later on Hegel on this occasion, is a way of reproducing this age-old distinction. The part that I find intriguing, and that I agree with you that we should be more precise in saying that it is a form of activity and not direct action, should be supplemented with the reverse by saying not only that political action is the precondition for thinking, but also that thinking is the precondition for political action. With her own arguments, I would like to evoke the issue of thoughtlessness. With thoughtlessness, no action can be deemed political. And that's why I would not, argue for a primacy of thinking over action or anything. I would say that both mutually precondition themselves, so to speak.
Any question, other questions, commentaries?
Actually, can we go back to your question? Actually, I don't know what your name is, but so something that popped up is when it comes to audience expectations of improvisers and improvisation. In the ancient Greek polis, there was this idea that even written speeches, at some point, the politicians, citizens started to write out speeches or hire sophists to write out speeches. And even those written speeches would contain small fragments pretending to be improvised, so pretending improvisation, such as, oh, wait a minute, I forgot what to say, as a quote. So that highlights how much the demos as a political audience expected politicians to improvise. That's just something that I wanted to add to it. Sorry.
Oh, hi, thank you for the intervention and for your speeches. It was very interesting. It's just to rebound on what you said about thoughtlessness and to link it with improvisation, because if you go and say that improvisation is a state where, I wanted to know if you could say that improvisation, is it a state of thoughtlessness or is it a state of free thought? Because to think would presume intention. If we base that on the fact that improvisation is something that is free and automatic, can we say that there is intention in improvisation? And is there thought in improvisation, or is it another type of thought? And just to link it to Trump as well, to say that he would improvise, and if we were to say that improvisation was thoughtless, how can we say that in thoughtlessness is not political? I don't know if you understand my question, because I was a bit all over the place, but if you need me to clear anything else.
Oh, very interesting question. Thank you. So you were asking about thoughtlessness as it relates to improvisation, right?
Exactly.
I mean, that's where
Exactly.
That's where I would be able to perhaps answer. This is a very contentious topic. I would say that there's two answers possible. One is a very romantic answer, or a romantic notion of improvisation as kind of like the subconscious, or going, to express yourself in the moment without any thought. There's a kind of utopian or kind of romantic kernel to that. And but then in reality, I personally think when it comes to stage improvisation, so artistic improvisation, thought is very much part of that. Like, you think about where you want to go, and you mentioned intention. Is that right?
Intention as well.
Yeah. So the whole idea is to get from one point to another point when you improvise, and then there's all kinds of ways to do so. And then also the idea is that when you improvise, you should take into account how audience responds to what you are doing, and then react accordingly. So I believe that also has to do with thinking, with the activity of thinking. And the first notion of improvisation as being without thought and being completely, letting yourself go, or pure expressivity. With Arendt, I don't think she would have liked that. She would have not agreed with that kind of expressivism or something like that. Definitely not in political terms. Yeah, does that help? Does that?
Yes, it does.
Yeah?
It clears up some things for me. Thank you.
So can you please repeat why is?
It was that if we were to presume, the question is answered, so maybe the second question doesn't have any relevance anymore. If we were to link thoughtlessness to improvisation, how could we say that Trump, who is a politician that improvises, his action would be non-political?
The short answer would be that his action would be anti-political. The long answer would be that if we understand maybe not politics, but political action as something that can be done only through thinking, through interaction with others, through a, let's say, collective action, that is, it can be improvised, but it cannot be thoughtless. I think there is a problem here with the concept of improvisation and thoughtlessness. I would prefer the term, if you use it, or did you, the free thought?
Free thought. Yeah.
Free thought.
Yeah.
Arendt uses, for instance, also very, she uses like train thought. It's common English expression to denote, let's say, associations. Free.
So how did you say it?
Train thought.
Train thought.
Train thought.
Like train.
Both. Train of thought, but she also cuts it. Train dash thought. And that would be perhaps more appropriate than thoughtlessness to describe improvisation, if it is to be political.
Yes. The drum. But it's that big. We're speaking too much of non-deservable ruler, I think. However, I want to say, if I take what you now defined as that this link between improvisation and thinking, actually that Trump is not an improviser anymore. At least I see it like that. He's just thoughtless and not improviser.
I'm afraid I have to disagree. And by disagreeing, I by no means defend Trump in any sense. But I'm afraid there is a certain what is it called? A certain kind of performance, like a performative capacity that unfortunately he does have, and that sometimes it does work. And I do think that that has to do with thinking, but of course they're not in thinking in Arendt's sense. I guess that's true. But I for example, when he was nearly shot, like a year ago at one of these rallies, you remember, right, like the second after it happened, he must have thought this is a good time to get up and to do like a show. And what did he say? Fight, fight, fight. Right? You remember that? Fight, fight, fight. And I do think that is artistically, aesthetically speaking, it was an improvisation. And I think politically speaking, obviously it's evil, it's sly, but unfortunately it was effective. So this kind of goes into the distinction between aesthetics and ethics and all that kind of stuff. Like something could be aesthetically good, but deployed for an evil end.
Next commentary question. I have a question which intrigues me since a longer time when we are talking about art and Hannah Arendt. Is there some special sort of how do you say, Erkenntnis, of recognition of new insights which are not scientific, which are not philosophical, which are artistically organized? I forgot to tell you that Mirt is not only a philosopher but also a novel writer. So we have some more aspects of experiences of this for this question, Pat. This was a question to you both.
Okay. So you were asking if is there any way that the arts can provide special insights into politics specifically, or more general? Yeah. Well, I'd like to say yes, of course. And I do think so. If, for example, let me think. For example, Arendt's notion of spaces and public spaces. I admit that I don't think that maps one-on-one on the situation of a performance. Tonight I will do a performance, as I said, and that, I guess, perhaps would also be an Arendtian space of appearance. But perhaps she would not have seen it as a public space, but maybe like a semi-public space. So it's but there is some insights in it because of the fact that it contains a plurality of people and there's interaction going on. And then perhaps you could see how what works aesthetically in performances, how perhaps political performances lack in doing that, or perhaps could learn from artists or speakers. That's just one thing that pops up. Also, when it comes to the art of persuasion, which is a very Arendtian theme, I guess artists are trained in a way that they have to persuade or entertain audiences. And that, I think, is also a part of politics and should be part of politics. And perhaps some politicians are better at it than others. Those are two things that I would say.
Would you like to maybe return to Arendt quoting Heidegger that poetry and thinking are close neighbors? So what does it mean? I mean, being close neighbors, she, of course, Heidegger neither want to assert that this is the same thing. So there is a distinction between the specificity of thinking as such and poetry, which we can take as a general placeholder for arts in general, where the main distinction, I think, would be that poetry which lent also the word for creation, for artistic creation in general, as Hannah-Arendt herself points out in The Human Condition, for the activity of poiesis, which purpose is to create certain products and certain objects that would be like memorials of a certain individual or culture or period of time that would be more durable than anything else. So like melancholic creation of objects that are destined to be there while we will be already gone. And on the other hand, thinking that its purpose it's to revolve around anything it revolves, but it creates nothing. And actually, Hannah Arendt in The Life of the Mind dwells quite a lot about this activity of thinking that also Vlasta yesterday mentioned, that it is destructive, that it does destroy not only our experiences, our sensible experiences of everyday life, or even our political experience or historical experiences. Destroys in which sense? In the sense that it moves them from reality to the realm of thinking, where they become thought things. And this transmutation, this radical transmutation of things into thought things, is one aspect of its destructivity, let's say. It's more of a translationability, if I may say. It's so, but the most radical aspects, which also Vlasta pointed out yesterday, I think it's that thinking destroys its own products. So thinking destroys itself, so that at the end, when we stop thinking, when we stop the activity of thinking, we indeed seem, like Plato says in the Statesman, like someone who wakes up and finds his own thoughts as mere dreams. And in this sense, the ultimate example again is Socrates, who ironically or unironically held this position of thinking that he does not know nothing. So whatever round we do with thinking, we cannot assert or derive any knowledge out of it, be it scientific knowledge or let's say political knowledge. In this sense, I think art has, in all its forms, also including rhetorics, has a capacity to emotionally move people, like Dasha asserted yesterday and today again, and that this is perhaps the link between politics and art that should be best explored, and why I think we should reread Aristotle's Rhetorics to see what's going on there. Because speaking, not only if we imagine one of the elements of totalitarianism, the Trumpian kind of leader that speaks to the masses, appeals to their emotions, etc., but the very elementary experience of speaking when we try to act together as equals, which would be, let's say, the ideal political situation, we nevertheless have to use words. And the very usage of words is already a link, and a problematic link a bit there between various, because it crosses various kinds of activities. And this is another massive topic from the Life of the Mind that we should explore on a different occasion. So I think there is a future for Arendtian talk and talks and conferences in the future where we can tackle all these issues.
Yeah. Only one remark. In her essay about Isaac Dinesen, she writes about writing literature, is describing things without committing the mistake to name what is in the center of all. This is what you feel there, what you get from there is insight by literature. And I hope you don't say what it is about when you're writing a novel. No?
I'm very careful not to.
Yeah. So I think the time is over from our program. Is the time for a conclusion? Vlasta? It's in the program written. Who? Yeah, it's wonderful. So I need to see that you are all here in spite of the difficult topics that we are discussing here, that we could go on all together is a wonderful impression I take with me from here. And it's like always, you go to the street, you go outside, and you're missing something. You say this was some sort of community of discussion, of experiences. And one can only say thank you very much, Vlasta, for organizing this. All the others here too, the Goethe, the university, and this place, and hoping to come back. Thank you.